50,000 Russian troops, cut off, not retreating in good order, not regrouping behind defensive lines, cut off. In the span of just 72 hours, Ukraine executed a maneuver so audacious, so precisely calculated, that it caught Moscow's entire southern command structure completely flat-footed. This was not an incremental gain. This was not a tactical adjustment. This was the systematic isolation of one of the largest Russian force concentrations in the entire theater. And the weapon that made it possible is something the Kremlin thought it had already neutralized. Welcome to States News. If this is your first time here, subscribe and turn on notifications because what I'm about to show you is not just a battlefield update. This is a masterclass in how modern combined arms warfare can still produce strategic shocks that change the entire trajectory of a conflict. I'm going to show you exactly how Ukraine pulled this off, the specific capabilities they deployed that Russia did not see coming, and why this development has implications that extend far beyond the immediate battlefield. We will cover the technical systems that made this encirclement possible, the strategic miscalculations that left 50,000 Russian troops exposed, and the cascading consequences this creates for Moscow's entire operational posture in southern Ukraine. By the end, you will understand why this represents the single most significant Ukrainian operational success since the Kharkiv counteroffensive, and why the Pentagon is quietly recalibrating its assessments of how this war ends. Now, to understand why this matters, you need to understand what Ukraine has been facing for the past 8 months. Since the summer of 2025, Russia has been grinding forward across multiple axes in Donetsk and Zaporizhzhia oblasts. The strategy has been brutally simple: concentrate overwhelming numbers, accept catastrophic casualties, trade bodies for meters of territory. Western intelligence estimates put Russian casualties at somewhere between 1,200 and 1,500 per day during peak offensive operations. That is not sustainable for any military on Earth, but Vladimir Putin has demonstrated he will sustain it anyway, as long as it produces territorial gains he can showcase domestically. The result has been slow but steady Russian advances. Nothing dramatic, nothing that breaks Ukrainian lines entirely, but enough to create the impression of momentum. Enough to feed Russian propaganda narratives about inevitable victory. Enough to generate anxiety in Western capitals about Ukraine's ability to hold indefinitely without dramatically increased support. Ukraine's challenge has been clear. They lack the numerical superiority to match Russia in attritional warfare. They cannot trade casualties at Russian rates because they do not have Russian population reserves. So Ukrainian strategy has necessarily focused on asymmetric advantages: superior battlefield intelligence through Western satellite and signals intelligence support, more effective combined arms coordination between artillery, armor, and infantry, and crucially, technological capabilities that Russia cannot match or counter effectively. But asymmetric advantages only matter if you can create conditions to exploit them. And that requires not just defending effectively, but identifying moments when your opponent creates exploitable vulnerabilities through their own operational choices. What happened over the past 72 hours is exactly that. Ukraine identified a critical Russian vulnerability, developed a plan to exploit it, and executed with a level of operational security that kept Moscow completely in the dark until it was too late to respond. The specific vulnerability emerged from Russia's force disposition in the Melitopol salient. For context, Melitopol is a critical logistics hub approximately 100 kilometers north of the Crimean coast. It sits at the intersection of several major road and rail networks that connect Crimea to Russian-occupied territories further east. Control of Melitopol effectively determines whether Russia can sustain large-scale operations across the entire southern front. Over the past 6 months, Russia concentrated a massive force around Melitopol, approximately 50,000 troops organized into multiple brigade tactical groups with extensive artillery support, armor concentrations, and air defense systems. The logic was straightforward. Hold Melitopol and you maintain the logistics corridor that makes everything else possible. Lose Melitopol and the entire southern operational picture collapses. But concentrating 50,000 troops creates vulnerabilities. That many soldiers require enormous logistic support: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, all flowing along predictable routes. And in modern warfare, predictable routes are vulnerable routes, especially when your opponent has capabilities you do not fully understand or cannot effectively counter. Here is what Ukraine did. Over the past 3 weeks, they quietly repositioned long-range strike capabilities to positions that provided coverage of the primary logistics routes feeding the Melitopol concentration. These were not the Soviet-era systems Russia has learned to locate and target. These were ATACMS missiles, the MGM-140 variant with the 300-kilometer range that the United States finally authorized Ukraine to use against targets in occupied territories back in late 2025. Now, Russia knew Ukraine had ATACMS. That is not news. What Russia apparently did not anticipate was how Ukraine would employ them in a coordinated campaign specifically designed to create cascading logistics failures rather than simply striking individual high-value targets. The operation began at Oro 300 local time 3 days ago. In the span of 6 hours, Ukraine launched 27 ATACMS strikes against rail infrastructure, bridge crossings, ammunition storage facilities, and fuel depots along the 3 primary logistics routes connecting Melitopol to Russian supply lines extending into Crimea and further east. These were not random targets. This was systematic destruction of nodes that analysis had identified as irreplaceable within operationally relevant timeframes. Let me be specific about what irreplaceable means in this context. A destroyed bridge can potentially be bypassed with pontoon crossings or alternate routes. A destroyed ammunition depot can be replaced by shifting storage to dispersed locations. But when you simultaneously eliminate multiple bridges, cut rail lines at multiple points, destroy fuel storage that represents weeks of accumulated stockpiles, and crater roads at choke points where geographic terrain makes alternate routes impractical, you create a logistics crisis that cannot be solved quickly. The Russians had protected these sites. They deployed extensive air defense coverage, S-300 and S-400 systems, Pantsir short-range systems, electronic warfare platforms designed to disrupt GPS guidance. But ATACMS employs both GPS and inertial guidance with terminal maneuvering capability. You can degrade it, but you cannot neutralize it entirely, especially when strikes come in coordinated salvos designed to overwhelm defensive response. Ukrainian military intelligence sources speaking to Defense Express confirmed that 24 of the 27 ATACMS reached their targets. That is an 89% success rate against heavily defended strategic infrastructure. 3 missiles were intercepted. 24 completed their missions. Now here is where the tactical becomes strategic. With logistics routes severed, those 50,000 Russian troops around Melitopol face a very specific problem. They have ammunition and fuel for current operations, but no way to replenish once current stocks are exhausted. Russian military doctrine calls for brigade tactical groups to maintain approximately 7 days of supplies for sustained combat operations. After that, they require resupply or operational effectiveness degrades rapidly. Ukraine did not stop with the logistics strikes. Phase 2 began 18 hours after the initial ATACMS campaign. Ukrainian forces launched a coordinated ground offensive from multiple directions, specifically designed not to break through Russian defensive positions, but to force Russia to expend ammunition and fuel defending against sustained pressure. Think about the position this creates. You are a Russian commander with 50,000 troops, substantial ammunition stocks, armor, artillery, but you know resupply is not coming because the roads and rails are cut. Every artillery barrage you fire brings you closer to the point where you cannot fire anymore. Every tank movement burns fuel you cannot replace, and the enemy is attacking not to break your lines, but specifically to force you to burn through those irreplaceable stocks. This is not about destroying the Russian force through direct combat. This is about creating conditions where the force destroys its own combat effectiveness through the simple mathematics of consumption without replenishment. Ukrainian sources claim Russian forces around Melitopol are currently expending ammunition at approximately 120% of planned rates due to the intensity of Ukrainian pressure operations. At that consumption rate, with no resupply available, Western military analysts assess the force will reach critical ammunition shortage within 5 to 6 days from now. And here is the element that makes this genuinely devastating. Russia cannot easily relieve this force because Ukraine has achieved local air superiority over the battle space. Let me explain what that means and how it happened. For most of this war, neither side has achieved meaningful air superiority. Russian air power has been constrained by Ukrainian air defenses, particularly Soviet-era S-300 systems and Western-provided systems like NASAMS and Patriot batteries. Ukraine's air power has been even more constrained by Russia's extensive integrated air defense network. The result has been a ground war where air forces play supporting roles but cannot dominate. But over the past 4 months, Ukraine received and integrated F-16 Fighting Falcons supplied by European partners. These are not the latest Block 70 variants. These are older Block 40 and 50 models from European stocks. But they represent a qualitative leap over Ukraine's Soviet-era Air Force in one critical dimension. They can employ Western precision-guided munitions with targeting systems that Soviet aircraft cannot integrate. Specifically, Ukraine has been using F-16s to deliver JDAM-ER munitions, GPS-guided bombs with extended-range glide kits. These weapons allow aircraft to release from standoff distances beyond the engagement envelope of many Russian air defense systems, particularly older systems that form the bulk of Russian coverage. In the 48 hours since the logistics strikes began, Ukrainian F-16s have flown approximately 60 strike sorties against Russian positions around Melitopol. They have targeted command posts, air defense radars, artillery positions, and critically every attempt by Russian forces to establish alternate logistics routes or helicopter resupply operations. Russian forces shot down 2 Ukrainian F-16s, confirmed by both Ukrainian and Russian sources. But 58 strike sorties reached their targets and delivered munitions effectively. That is a strike success rate that Russia simply cannot counter with available air defense assets, especially when those assets are themselves burning through irreplaceable missile stocks. The Kremlin's options here are extraordinarily limited. They can attempt a ground relief operation, pushing forces from outside the encirclement to break through Ukrainian positions and re-establish logistics corridors. But that requires concentrating forces for offensive operations, which creates exactly the kind of target-rich environment where Ukraine's ATACMS and F-16 capabilities are most effective. They can attempt helicopter resupply using Mi-8 transport helicopters flying nap-of-the-earth profiles to avoid air defense. But Ukrainian Stinger teams and mobile air defense systems have already demonstrated capability to engage low-flying helicopters, and the volume of supplies required to sustain 50,000 troops exceeds what helicopter logistics can realistically provide. They can attempt to break out, withdrawing the encircled forces to defensible positions where logistics are viable. But breakout operations under enemy pressure are among the most difficult military operations to execute successfully. They require mobility, fuel, and covering fire, all of which are precisely the resources the encircled force is running short on. Or they can hold in place and hope Ukraine lacks the combat power to reduce the pocket before international diplomatic intervention creates conditions for negotiated withdrawal. This is almost certainly what Moscow will attempt, because it is the option that preserves force structure, even if it sacrifices operational initiative. But here is why that calculation may not work. Ukraine has demonstrated they are willing to accept significant casualties to reduce this pocket, because the strategic payoff is enormous. Every day this force remains isolated is a day Russia cannot employ it offensively elsewhere. Every day they burn through irreplaceable stocks is a day Russian offensive capability across the entire southern front degrades, and Ukraine is receiving real-time intelligence support from Western satellite and signals intelligence assets that provide targeting information Russian forces cannot deny. NATO E-3 AWACS aircraft operating from Romanian airspace provide airspace awareness. American and European satellites provide targeting data with resolution accurate enough to identify individual vehicles and equipment concentrations. This is combined arms warfare functioning as it is designed to function. Strike assets create conditions. Ground forces exploit those conditions. Air assets prevent enemy response. And intelligence systems tie everything together into coordinated operations that achieve effects greater than the sum of individual components. Now let's talk about what this means beyond the immediate battlefield. If Ukraine succeeds in forcing surrender or withdrawal of this 50,000-man force that represents approximately 10% of Russia's entire deployed combat strength in Ukraine, that is not a tactical loss. That is a strategic catastrophe that changes calculations about Russia's ability to sustain offensive operations. Moscow has been mobilizing approximately 25,000 to 30,000 new troops per month to replace casualties and maintain force levels. Losing 50,000 in a single encirclement would require nearly 2 months of mobilization just to replace the lost numbers, before even accounting for ongoing attrition elsewhere. And these would be trained, equipped units being replaced by newly mobilized personnel with minimal training and inferior equipment. The economic implications matter as well. Russia's defense budget is already strained to breaking. They are spending approximately 7% of GDP on defense, a level that is sustainable only by cannibalizing other economic sectors and burning through financial reserves. The equipment losses from this encirclement, particularly armor and artillery systems, represent billions of dollars in replacement costs that Russia increasingly cannot afford. There is also the psychological dimension. Russian state media has spent months promoting narratives of inevitable victory, steady advances, Ukrainian collapse just over the horizon. A catastrophic encirclement of this scale would be impossible to hide or spin as anything other than a devastating defeat. That creates domestic political pressures Putin would have to address. And then there are the international implications. Western governments have been calibrating support to Ukraine based on assessments of whether Ukraine can realistically achieve strategic victories or whether the conflict will grind toward stalemate requiring negotiated settlement. A Ukrainian operational success of this magnitude would strengthen arguments for increased support and undermine voices calling for pressure on Kyiv to accept territorial concessions. But we need to acknowledge the complications and limitations here. First, this operation is not complete. Those 50,000 Russian troops are isolated but not destroyed or captured. Russia has demonstrated throughout this war a capacity to endure catastrophic losses and continue operations. Assuming this encirclement automatically translates to strategic collapse would be premature. Second, Ukraine is burning through its own limited stocks of ATACMS and precision munitions to achieve this. The United States and European partners have provided substantial quantities, but they are not unlimited. If Ukraine expends the majority of its long-range strike capability, reducing this pocket, they may lack the means to exploit subsequent opportunities. Third, we do not have complete information about Russian contingency planning. It is possible Moscow has logistics workarounds or reserve capabilities we are not seeing in open-source reporting. The fog of war cuts both ways, and Ukrainian operational security, while impressive, does not guarantee Russian incompetence. Fourth, the humanitarian implications of a sustained siege are severe. There are civilian populations in areas around Melitopol who would bear the costs of prolonged combat operations. Ukraine has generally demonstrated concern for civilian protection, but the pressure to achieve military objectives creates tensions with humanitarian imperatives. And fifth, this success depends heavily on Western intelligence and weapons systems. That is not a criticism, it is a fact. If Western support wavers or is reduced, Ukraine's ability to execute operations at this level of sophistication degrades significantly. The sustainability of Western support remains an unresolved political question in multiple donor countries. So where does this leave us? As of now, Ukraine has created a crisis for Russian forces that Moscow has no good options to resolve. The encircled troops can fight for perhaps 5 more days before ammunition shortages become critical. Russia can attempt relief operations, but at costs that may exceed the value of the forces being relieved. And Ukraine has demonstrated capabilities that fundamentally change assessments of the military balance. What happens next depends on decisions being made right now in Kyiv and Moscow. Does Ukraine press the attack to force surrender, or do they hold the encirclement and leverage it for diplomatic gain? Does Russia sacrifice additional forces in relief attempts, or do they write off the encircled troops and consolidate elsewhere? And critically, how do Western capitals interpret this development? Does it strengthen resolve to support Ukraine toward outright victory, or does it create fears of Russian escalation that drive pressure for negotiations? Those questions will be answered in the days ahead. But what we know right now is this: Ukraine just demonstrated they can still achieve strategic surprises against a numerically superior opponent. They can integrate Western weapon systems into sophisticated combined arms operations, and they can create battlefield conditions that force Russia to confront the possibility of catastrophic defeat, not just grinding attrition. This is not the end of the war, but it may be the beginning of the end of Russia's capacity to sustain offensive operations at scale, and that changes everything about how this conflict concludes. Stay with States News for continued analysis as this situation develops. We will be tracking Russian response, Ukrainian next moves, and Western policy implications, because understanding how modern warfare actually functions requires going beyond the headlines to the operational realities that determine outcomes. That is what we do here. That is the analysis you need to understand what is really happening. Subscribe, turn on notifications, and I will see you in the next one.